just going back to what we were discussing about the military, we see quite a lot in the media about the brutal forces of the Israeli army and on the other side. Why do you think that the Israeli forces haven't been so condemned, perhaps in Israel, for their use of force, particularly when dealing with conflict in Israel and Palestine?
Okay, so I'm going to reject the concept, the premise of the conversation, of the question. I don't accept that the army is brutal.
Okay.
I don't accept that the army is acting in any way that is inappropriate. Look, there's no question that in any army, anywhere in the world, there are individual soldiers who do things that are wrong, that are illegal, and that need to be dealt with. And actually, we saw this week the Israeli army imprisoned 3 soldiers for something they did, and to announce they were opening an inquiry into 7 others for things that they did in the Gaza border. But actually, the Israeli army acts in a way to reduce civilian conflict, to reduce civilian casualty in any way they possibly can. There is a very, very, very strict code of conduct, a very, very strict code of engagement, a code of engagement that is stricter, by the way, than the British Army. It's stricter than the American Army, and I know this because I've had conversations with both the British and the American legal teams that are involved in making decisions. Any time the Israeli army has to be involved in a decision of bombing or something like that, there is a lawyer in the room that makes that decision with them. And our decisions are always based on minimizing civilian casualties. And I'll ask you 2 questions. Okay, and they're questions that I'm not really looking for an answer there, but I'm also not going to give you my answer. I'm asking you because I'd like you to go away and think about them. Question number 1 is, if you have somebody standing with a gun, or standing with an axe and is running towards you, but in front of them is a child, do you attempt to stop that person running at you by shooting them and risk hitting the child, or do you not? Same thing if you see them running down the street. You see someone running down the street firing a gun at you while holding a little kid. Do you shoot at that person and try and stop them shooting at you, risk hitting the kid, or don't you? If you're looking in a house in Gaza, and that house in Gaza, let's say, is a 2-bedroom house, and in one room in the house, Hamas, who is the brutal Islamist terrorist organisation that runs Hamas, they've put in that house 20 rockets, 20 missiles, and they forced the local population, they forced these people to take it. They don't have a choice because it's not a democracy, and they're living in the other room of the house. And every so often, Hamas will come in, go onto the roof, and fire a rocket at an Israeli civilian population. And the family is still in there, husband, wife, 3 kids, let's say. Is that house a military target, or is it a civilian target? Are the family that are living in their house innocent, guilty, a legitimate military target, completely civilian, or somewhere in between? And I'm giving you these 3 examples, not because I'm throwing them out as random examples, but because they're 3 very real examples that we've dealt with on a very regular basis. And you need to give an answer. It's great to be able to think it through in this classroom. But if you're that soldier and someone's firing at you, you need to decide like that. If you're in that operations room and the missile's being fired, you need to give an answer like that. And so, I don't think it's a fair question, because I don't think it takes into account the question of what's happening and the very real moral dilemmas that we face on a day-to-day basis in a conflict, in asymmetrical warfare, and it's a conflict that the Americans and the British and other democracies are finding when you're fighting against a terrorist organisation that's embedded within a civilian population.
Okay. So, whilst discussing Gaza and the region, do you think that the current situation with Gaza is one of the biggest barriers to peace? And if so, how do you think that we can go about negotiating this crisis?
I think the greatest barrier to peace is the Palestinian refusal to accept that Israel exists, to accept our right to exist. Now, what do I mean by that? Israel is the expression of self-determination of the Jewish people in our ancient homeland. Israel's been the Jewish people's homeland for 3,000 years. We've returned there. That doesn't negate, by the way, the Palestinian desire, need, requirement for self-determination in that piece of land. So the Palestinians can also have their self-determination in that land. But if I'm going to accept the right of Palestinian self-determination, the very minimum I should expect from them is that they accept my right to self-determination as a Jewish homeland. And they haven't yet done that. They haven't yet accepted that the Jewish people are a people and that we have a right to live in this land as a nation in our ancient homeland. And it's more than that. Because what people have often said to us is that actually this is a conflict that if only you would withdraw, from certain territories, you can have peace. And yet, we see in Gaza where we did exactly that. We withdrew in 2005, and that's our most violent border. And the reason it's our most violent border is because Hamas is a radical terror organisation that's insistent on destroying the state of Israel. And so I think that Gaza isn't the biggest blockage to peace. The blockage to peace is the people, the leadership of Hamas, who are fundamentally opposed to us existing in any form whatsoever.
Okay. So one of the things that we see a lot about in the media recently is how Palestinian supporters are trying to deal with this, and it's a movement called BDS. I was wondering if you could explain a bit about it, and if you think what are the Israeli view on the growth of this movement.
So there's a movement called the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, the BDS movement. Okay, it's a very small but very, very noisy movement. And they say that you have to boycott, divest and sanction Israel because Israel's a terrible place and that's the only way we're going to resolve this issue. So I've got a couple of questions for them. First, I want to say to them, you're a failure. Okay, you're a failure by any definition. Okay, if you want to boycott and divest from Israel, you're doing the worst job in history. Okay, and why do I say that? Because if I look, for example, just at British and Israel trade, 2 years ago, Britain-Israel trade was £7 billion a year, and that was 25% increase on the year before. Last year, that went up to £8.6 billion between the two countries. Okay, 1 in 6 prescriptions on the NHS are fulfilled by an Israeli company. There are over 300 companies in this country providing jobs. Okay, there are over 50 flights a week to Israel, between Israel and Britain, direct, and they're all running over 90% capacity. Okay, so objectively, it's a failure in that sense. Okay, if you look last week, a company called Melnox was bought for $6.9 billion. Okay, Mobileye was bought by Intel for $14 billion. Okay? Israeli technology, Israeli company, Israeli economy is a success. It's growing. It's everybody recognises it. Israel is Britain's largest trade partner in the Middle East. Okay, it's bigger than all the other countries you think of. It's bigger than Saudi Arabia. It's bigger than all of the other Gulf countries. Israel is the biggest trade partner of Britain in the Middle East. Okay, so it's an objective failure. But I've got a much bigger question, which is all of those people who are saying you need to boycott Israel. What's it all about? Why would you do that? Okay? If you believe that there needs to be some future peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the only way that's ever going to happen is through conversation and through dialogue. If you don't boycott, if you say to the Palestinians, whatever you do, don't talk to them, don't engage with them, that's never going to help them achieve peace. The reality is the Palestinians are not going to beat us militarily. No one really thinks that militarily they're going to win. So therefore, the only way they're going to come to any agreement with us is to sit down with us. If you say to them, don't sit down, you're just driving peace further away. You're just pushing peace further away. And more than that, when you stand outside and protest and you say, don't let the Israeli come speak here, Israel's the biggest problem in the Middle East. You can't really believe that. Are you really telling me that the greatest problem today in the Middle East, forget the world, but the biggest problem in the Middle East today is Israel? Greater than Syria? Greater than Yemen? Greater than Iran? Greater than Saudi Arabia? Who are you kidding? Who are you kidding if you think that's the biggest issue in the Middle East? And you think that's the biggest issue in the world? Venezuela? The list goes on. So to say that means you are singling out Israel. You are singling out the only Jewish state for treatment that you wouldn't expect from any other place in the world. And so I asked the question, why are they doing it? Because it doesn't make sense other than.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you one more question about the recent nation-state law. Do you think this law is posing a barrier to peace? And if so, what ways do you agree with the law?
Okay, so the nation-state law was recently, as you said, was recently passed in Israel. I encourage anybody who has heard of it or has got questions about it to read it. Okay? It's not long. It's 1 page of A4 in English. Okay? That's it. Read it. A couple of things I think it's important to say. Firstly, it was controversial in Israel. Okay? There were different opinions within Israeli society, within Israeli democracy about whether this was the right law to pass or it wasn't the right law to pass. Now, as I said, Israel's only 70 years old. We don't have a constitution. When the country found, we didn't really have all of these basic laws. So this law does 3 things. First thing it does is it lays down basic principles that everybody knows are true but are never stated in law anywhere. And I'll give you some silly examples. It says the flag will be white with 2 blue stripes and a Star of David in the middle. That isn't in law anywhere in our country. It says that the national anthem will be called Hatikva, the hope. We know that's the truth. And it goes through laying out lots of different things. There are 2 clauses in there that were controversial. Okay? Clause number 1 was about the Hebrew language. And the Hebrew language clause is a confusing clause that I think actually was not very well worded. It says in there that Hebrew language will be the main language of the state of Israel, but it will not in any way affect the status that Arabic already holds. Okay? In Israel, Arabic and Hebrew are 2 equal languages. They're the language of the state of Israel. So this law said Hebrew will be the first language, but it won't do anything to affect the status of the Arab language. But the status of the Arab language was equal with Hebrew. So no one's quite sure what that law exactly means because it's badly worded. So that's one of the other criticisms of it. And the other criticism was, it said that Israel is the only people who can have self-determination. Israel is the Jewish people. Okay, now what does that law say? It says that in Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, and therefore the Jewish people are the only people who can have self-determination. That doesn't mean that everybody else doesn't have equal rights and don't have equal rights under the law and don't have everything else that a democracy has. What it says is that the same thing it says in England. The only people who have self-determination in England are the English. The only people that have self-determination in Switzerland are the Swiss. Doesn't mean that other people don't have the right to be there, but it means it's the nation-state law of it. And that's the clause that caused the most controversy. And it caused the most decision. Other people argue there should have been another line that said, but everybody has equal rights. But there are other laws that say that everybody has equal rights and that everybody has all rights. So that was the controversy over it. There's an election campaign going on at the moment. And by the way, the nation-state law is one of those things that's being discussed in the election campaign.
Great. So on that note, I want to open it up and see if any of you have any questions about something we've already discussed or anything else that interests you. What do you think?
Well, people start their book.
So I want to ask about the corruption allegations for Benjamin Netanyahu and the implications for the election commission.
Okay. So I'll
And actually what do you think about it in general as well?
Okay, so you're never going to get my answer on the second. Have a nice try. As a diplomat who doesn't express opinions except in the ballot box, then and I get to vote, by the way. I just can't tell anyone who I voted for. And we vote in London. Quite interesting. We get to vote in the embassy. Israeli voting law is very antiquated in that sense. Just so you know, I get caught up in some of these things. So I'm sorry. I do love some of these things, and then I'll answer the question. In Israel, when you vote with an envelope. Okay? When you go, they give you an envelope, and then in the envelope you put a small piece of paper about that size with the letter of the party that you want to vote for. Okay, this is all from the time when people just came to Israel, didn't speak Hebrew, and therefore had to work out a system that would work for people who were illiterate and couldn't necessarily speak Hebrew, and therefore what you would have is a letter. You'd have a letter on the piece of paper, and you just choose the piece of paper, put it inside there, and then they count their open up. So that's the same way it votes now. In terms of the allegations, look, there are allegations, and the allegations are very serious against the Prime Minister. At the moment, there is a pre-trial hearing a pre-hearing rather, that will take place sometime in July. And subject to that hearing, the Attorney General will decide whether or not to charge the Prime Minister with various crimes, including bribery and others. We have an independent judiciary. The judiciary will make the decision about whether or not to charge the Prime Minister and whether or not, whether to charge, and then the trial will be independent. To my great shame and my great pride, a previous Prime Minister, Diplomat, has been convicted and was sent to prison, and a previous President was convicted and sent to prison. The reason I say my great pride and my great shame is because it's a shame to have the President and Prime Minister sent to prison. It's pride to know that nobody's above the law. And that no matter what happens, there will be justice. And actually, the judge that sentenced the president to prison was actually an Arab Israeli. And for me, that was quite a symbolic moment about a real message about equality within the system, that an Arab Israeli could send the president to prison. So that will take its time, and we will see. Initially, when the announcement was made, there was likely to be some sort of charges. It had an effect in the polls. And actually, Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party dropped very significantly and was trailing by about between 5 and 7 seats in all of the opinion polls. According to the opinion polls this evening, Prime Minister Likud's party is now leading by between 3 and 5 seats. So it's quite a seesaw election, and over the next 3 weeks we'll see how that develops and what happens.
And why is it a problem in Israeli politics?
Sorry?
Why is it a problem in kind of the Israeli political system, corruption charges you mentioned?
So I don't know.
Given its short history, that's
I don't know that it is such a problem. I mean, obviously it's a problem, but I don't know within our system, and it's a question, is it that we have more corruption, or is it that we have a system that investigates it more aggressively and brings people to trial more aggressively? There's certainly a number of ministers, there's lots of investigations, there's certainly something that isn't nice, but at the same time, I know that it's seriously investigated. My question would be, are there other democracies that would bring a president and a prime minister to trial and put them in prison? I don't know the answer. I'd like to think yes, but I think it's maybe more about our judicial system than it is about the individuals concerned. But it will be, I'm sure someone someday will do a thesis on this and do a proper investigation as to whether or not there is more corruption or there's just a better or a more aggressive judicial system.
Thank you.
And do you think that Israel's foreign policy is too reliant on the United States?
No, but give me an example of what you mean.
So the fact that they receive such a lot of military and economic aid, but also the fact that your security in Israel is very dependent on the deterrence that you get from US support, and that the US has vetoed a lot of UN resolution proposals for the sake of Israel in terms of Israel-Palestinian negotiations.
So I'm going to split that into two. I would say that one is the military piece and one of them is the diplomatic piece. So dealing with the military piece first. Certainly in the past, American military aid and military support was absolutely critical to Israel. There's no question, if you look at the Yom Kippur War, without the massive airlift that the Americans made, that was likely to be the end of Israel, and Israel probably would have been wiped out, and who knows what would have happened. Today, I think that it is less so in direct aid in that sense. But one of the things that we talk about is the Iron Dome. For those people who don't know, the Iron Dome system is an Israeli missile defense system that basically shoots missiles out the sky. Somebody described this to me as, imagine a Coke bottle flying through the air all over the place, and you had to hit it with a water bottle and somehow knock it out of the sky. That's basically what the system does. It detects a missile, works out what its trajectory is, if it's going to land on a civilian population or in an open area, and then shoots it out the sky. That was developed with American funding. The Americans are now buying that system because they recognise they need it, and other countries have also expressed interest in doing it. So whether that means that actually that's good for us, or that's good for the Americans, is a very interesting question as to whether or not we benefited the most, or Americans benefited the most from it. So I think that today that reliance on American aid and American military aid is obviously very, very important, but I think that's mutually beneficial, and I don't think it has the same weight and the same influence and the same importance that it had 30 or 40 years ago. In relation to the United Nations, Look, the Americans have been our greatest ally and continue to be our greatest ally. That's also, by the way, the British are also very strong allies of ours. We have little faith in the United Nations system. We have little faith in the United States system because the United Nations isn't an organisation of democracies. It's an organisation where every country, regardless of its size and regardless of its type of government, has one vote. You can be a brutal dictatorship in the middle of the Middle East who are slaughtering your people, such as Syria, and you can be the world's largest democracy, such as India, and you each get one vote. And there's a disproportionate concept in there, which means that you, and because the vast majority are not democracies in the Middle East, in the United Nations, that causes a great problem. So the Security Council has been a place where we believe the United States has vetoed a number of resolutions that have been completely unfair and unbalanced. We're not against a serious, balanced approach to what's going on. What we are against is a one-sided approach. And if you take, for example, today, the United Nations Human Rights Council is meeting. There is a list of all the different countries they're going to condemn. It's us, by the way. Okay? If you look at the resolutions over the last year of the United Nations Human Rights Council, they have passed more motions condemning Israel than every other country in the world combined. Again, I don't care what your politics are. You may hate my country. That's okay. It's not okay, but that's okay. You cannot in any way tell me that of all of the human rights issues in the world, Israel is responsible for more than every other one in the world combined. No one thinks that's serious. Yet that's the issue of the United Nations for us. And for us, that's the reason why the veto and the American support is critical to us. And I don't think that it's a bias. I think that it's a just way that it acts. That was
You were talking before about Orthodox Jewry in Israel, and I know they're growing, but right now most Jews in Israel are unpracticing. They like to see themselves as Jewish just by default. Do you think the Israeli political system should, and do you think it will change soon to stop demonising non-Orthodox Jews, so conservative Jews and Reform Jews in Israel? Because I see that as a huge problem. Because in the summer there was a conservative rabbi that was arrested for doing non-Orthodox weddings, and I think to call Israel democracy, and which I do believe it is a democracy, but I think if it wants to maintain being a democracy and live up to its expectations of itself as a Jewish state and a democratic Jewish state, it needs to represent all Jews and all people living in the country. And how are we going to start doing that for all people if we can't even do that for all Jews?
You've added, there's so much wrapped up in that question. So those people who don't know, we go back to 1948 again, when the ultra-Orthodox had a conversation with Ben Gurion, the other convert about the army, they also said, what are we going to do about religion and state? Okay, all sorts of things that we all take for granted then. They said, what are we going to do about religion and state? So the Ben Gurion said, all right, whatever's going on now, today, is what we'll continue to do. We'll call it the status quo. Okay, so whatever's going on. So, travel on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. There were no public transport in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. So there's no public transport in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv on the Sabbath. In Haifa, which was a mixed city, there was public transport in Haifa. There still is today. There's no national policy. It's whatever was happening in 1948. Marriages. The only people who had license for marriages were the religious authorities. So they left them with the religious authorities. Remember, there was no real significant reform or conservative communities in 1948. Certainly not in Israel. And even in the diaspora in America, the communities were small. So they said, you'll carry on doing it as you do. So now the law in Israel is, you can only get married by a religious authority. There's no civil marriage in Israel. It presents all sorts of issues. Not only about Orthodox and non-Orthodox. If you're Christian, you can only marry a Christian. If you're Muslim, you can only marry a Muslim. If you're a Jew, you can only marry a Jew. Not because we say so, but because the church, the mosque, and the synagogue say so. And they run their own rules. Okay? So one of the challenges is now the growth of the Reform and the Conservative outside of Israel. And I would dispute your set about saying most Israeli Jews don't identify, they're not religious. There was a survey done recently. So we're coming up to Passover. The Passover service, the first night is called the Seder. It's called the first meal on the Passover night. They did a survey in Israel. 99% of Israelis have a Passover Seder. Over 90% of Israelis fast on Yom Kippur, the holiest day. Over 75% of Israelis light candles on a Friday night. Now they would say they're not religious. That's just what you do in Israel because it's a traditional piece. But actually, for people in the diaspora, they would consider those religious things that they're taking part in, religious symbolism. So Israelis very much don't see that as religious, and they wouldn't consider themselves religious, but they do religious things. As that's part of it. Israelis, by the way, no one drives on Yom Kippur. No one drives. It's not a law, by the way, but no one drives on Yom Kippur at all. There's no cars on the road. There's not a single car on the road for 25 hours. It's amazing. In the whole country. Okay, so all of these things happen in a way that of society that's got a tradition. Now, I agree with you, there are issues to do with relationship with diaspora Jewry, and issues to do with the way people express themselves. And I think that over a period of time, that will change, and that will develop. Look, the easiest way to do it is if more... I think that if I was advising the Reform and the Conservative movement, I'd say you're picking on the wrong issues. Israelis don't care about whether or not you go to the Western Wall and can pray in a mixed section or a single section. What they care about is marriage. And they care about civil marriage, and they care about all sorts of issues like that. Those are the issues that really worry them. And those are the issues that I think that Israelis will cover, and I think that eventually that will develop. And that will become an issue, and that will move forward. But the reality is that the vast majority of Israelis see themselves as orthodox, if not observant, but not observant. And therefore these issues just don't concern people enough in that sense. And I recognise that's causing challenges with liberal Jewish communities around the world. And that will be something that over the next 5 to 10 years, we as a country will have to deal with in some way.
First of all, thank you for coming and speaking today. I really enjoyed listening. And just to pick up on what you were saying about Israel being the most, condemned country, I suspect there's an element of countries playing up to the gallery because they know the US will veto any resolution as opposed to Israel actually being the most hated country. I was wondering, what outreach programs does Israel run into Palestine? So obviously you mentioned Hamas, and Hamas's role is in large part a result of poverty and kind of people not having much hope in that part of the world. And Israel obviously has a big stick as well, having a large military. But what is the carrot that it kind of offers to those people to encourage them to come to the peace table rather than just run away?
Okay, so it's a great question, thank you. There's two areas. You look at Gaza. Gaza's run by Hamas. Hamas is a brutal military Islamist terrorist group. And actually over the last couple of days, you probably haven't seen it in the news because it hasn't been covered, but there's been some very significant protests against the Hamas leadership. A number of journalists were in prison, people were shot on the street by Hamas, and they put down their protests and their people brutally, because the people in there are not happy with Hamas and what Hamas are doing. So that's there. On the other side, you've got Fatah, led by Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, same person, who is running the West Bank. Look, we've reached out, so there's two things. First, we're doing a lot of economic work with them. And secondly, we've reached out to them to come to the table to talk with us, and they're not willing to talk. They're not willing to sit down at the peace table. Now, I don't know what else we can do, and I'd be happy if there are suggestions, but we had a settlement freeze. Everyone says it's the settlements. We had a settlement freeze for 10 months. They didn't come to the table. We released prisoners. They didn't come to the table. So we've done lots of different things in order to encourage them to come to the table, and yet they're still not coming to the table. I can tell you that I heard my Prime Minister Netanyahu in London 3 times in the last year say very clearly, I'm willing to talk with the Palestinians anytime, any place. So When's that going to happen? Where is that conversation? When are they going to come to the table? So I think that's the first thing. That's part of it. The other thing is that we've said we're willing to make painful compromises. We're willing to make compromises that needed to be made in order to come to an agreement with the Palestinians. And the fun thing is when we talk about economics, there's a lot of stuff that's not talked about. There's a lot of partnerships, and there's a lot of joint programs, and there's a lot of joint businesses. I talked about Mellanox, the company that was sold to Nvidia last week or the week before, for 6.9 billion. What people don't know is that a number of their workers were in Gaza, and a number of their workers were in the West Bank, and they had percentages of their company. So they've received large amounts of money because of the sale of this company. So that's one example of a company that had workers in Gaza and workers in it. So that's also part of it. But what's our carrot? Our carrot is peace. Our carrot is sit down and negotiate with us, come to an agreement with us, and share in the economic miracle, and share in the brighter future, and share in the democracy, and share in the freedoms that we have. That's the carrot. We just can't make it happen if they're not willing to sit down with us. 1, 2, 3.
I was sort of wondering what you thought about the commonly drawn parallels between sort of the troubles in Northern Ireland and the situation in Israel and Palestine, and sort of in particular the Republican and Palestinian sort of drawing connection between each other.
So I need to be very careful here. I hear your accent, okay? So I need to be very, very careful in what I say. But I'll say this. I don't think that there's a commonality. There are clearly some connections, but I don't think there's a parallel. And I'll tell you where I think the connections are and where I think the parallels are different. So the connections are, and why is there a connection between the Irish Republican, the IRA specifically, which they're there, and the Palestinians, is because they went and trained in some of the same terror training camps. So leadership, the PLO terrorists and the IRA terrorists in the former Soviet Union and other places, they trained literally side by side in the same terrorist camps, and therefore they created a bond. Where is there and there's troubles, and there was an issue of fighting a guerrilla / terrorist / other population embedded within the civilian population, and troops being there and how to deal with that. Those are also some of the similarities. But the reality is that the Irish issue was only ever about Ireland. It was only ever about the future of Ireland, whether that's a united Ireland or not a united Ireland. The issue that we're dealing with, the Palestinians have always spoken about destroying Israel, about wiping Israel out, about getting rid of it. It was never in Ireland, it was never a fight for the future, for example, of Britain. It was never a case of the Irish saying we want to have a united Ireland and kick out anybody who is all the Irish out, or the Catholics weren't looking to kick out the Protestants and vice versa. In our conflict, the leadership, the radical leadership, have said quite openly they want to kill us all and kick us out. So it makes it a very different dynamic. And so therefore there are some of the issues, and actually I'm involved at the moment in some conversations. I just had an email literally 5 minutes before I walked into here. We're looking at having some interesting conversations between army veterans who served in Northern Ireland and some army veterans who served in the West Bank, to have a conversation about whether or not there's issues about post-trauma and about mental health and stuff like that, that although they're completely different situations, might be an interesting conversation to have about the effects of post-trauma and mental health. So I think those are an example where there's a connection, but I think that the two situations are very, very different. On the other side of things, it gives me hope. If you can solve that problem through dialogue, when everybody said it was an intractable situation that couldn't be resolved, then I like to hope that we can resolve our solution where everybody says it's an intractable situation that can't be resolved. So I think in some ways I take inspiration that this issue can be resolved without killing everybody and by talking. On the other side of things, I also recognise that the parallels are very, very different.
So my question is about the nation-state law. So I have read it, and the fact that the words democracy and equality don't appear at all in the law is very telling. So there's no recognition whatsoever of the presence of a Palestinian Arab minority. In fact, the law implicitly denies their very existence as an indigenous national minority that has a legitimate claim to national self-determination. So you said that it doesn't affect the fundamental status of minorities, fine. It's incredibly symbolic. And I think that it can be argued that it's probably one of the biggest problems
obviously disagree with you, and I'll tell you why. Okay. Firstly, it doesn't in any way deny an Israeli-Arab connection to Israel. It doesn't in any way deny Israeli-Arab rights for democracy or anything like that. What it does do is it says that Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Arabs do not have the right to self-determination in this land. It doesn't say they don't have the right to self-determination. The Arabs have 22 other countries in the Middle East that they have the right to self-determination, and the Palestinians have asked for a Palestinian state where they can have Palestinian self-determination. I'm not looking to have Jewish self-determination in any one of those countries. I'm not looking to have Jewish self-determination in any other place on earth. But I am looking to have Jewish self-determination in my country. And I'm not denying that to any other people or any other group. And that's what the law says. The law doesn't say that those things. Now the other thing is, if you take that law by itself, then everything you say you can argue. But the Declaration of Independence, the law on equal rights, the other basic laws that exist, all cover every single thing that you say and are abundantly clear in terms of equal rights, in terms of democratic rights, in terms of their right to freedom of expression, in terms of their right to all of their other rights in the country. So I hear what you're saying. And by the way, the criticism from Israel, a significant criticism in Israel, is that it doesn't add that extra clause which reinforces, as said in the Declaration of Independence, and as said in this law, that law, and this law, nothing will be done to affect the equal rights of all of its citizens. And that's the criticism, by the way. That one sentence would have got rid of all of that criticism. And there's a lot of internal criticism in Israel about it, that it's not there. But if you read it by itself, after me telling you just read that law, I'm now going back on myself and saying, I'm glad you read it, now read the other laws. And that builds up the package. Your criticism is not, I don't accept the criticism, I understand the criticism, and you're echoing criticism in Israel, and there's certainly a sentence that would have resolved it, but I don't think that it reflects a reality.
So if the Palestinians came to the peace table, what do you think would be the ideal territorial arrangement with Palestine next to Israel? And what, do you believe they should have a Palestinian state as well?
So here, you're having fun, aren't you, today? Okay, and I say good for you. When I said you asked the tough questions, you've taken these liberties. Okay. So, look, I'm not going to tell you where my red lines are. If I told you where my red lines are, for two reasons, first of all. Firstly, I don't know them. And if I did know them, I wouldn't tell you them because that kind of ruins my negotiating tactics. But I can give you some principles. And here are my principles. Principle number one, about a Palestinian state. We need to come to an agreement that works for the Palestinians. But if we talk about a Palestinian state, I have a right to know what that Palestinian state will look like. Is that Palestinian state going to be a dictatorship or is it going to be a democracy? Is it going to be a failed state, such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza? And if the answer to that question is yes, is that really in anybody's interest? Is that in the interest of Israel? Clearly not. But is it in the interest of the rest of the world to have another failed state? Is it in the interest of the Palestinians to have another Gaza, another Iraq, another Yemen, another Syria there? And I think the answer is no. So I think the answer to that question is we have to see what that state is, what it's proposing to be, and what the dynamic is. And then we have to resolve that with the Palestinians. We've made very clear we're happy for painful compromises. We've also said we need to be in control of our own security. And we've also said that we don't believe that Jerusalem should be divided and that we should be in control of Jerusalem. So those are the guidelines we've laid out. And other than that, we need to sit down and have a negotiation with the Palestinians about where we get to.
So I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza Strip. I'm talking about the state of Israel, not Israel. That whilst Palestinians, so non-Jewish Israelis, do have equal rights under the law, what would you say to the claim that whilst Palestinians have equal rights under the law, they still face de facto discrimination in the state of Israel? Not Palestinian territories, but the state of Israel.
So I'm going to give you some statistics and I'm going to give you some answers, okay? And I'm going to try and be very honest. And I want you to understand it in the context that we've had the rest of this conversation. So firstly, if you talk to the Israeli Arabs, the vast majority, and the survey was done last year by the Israel Democracy Institute, I recommend you read it, the vast majority define themselves as Israeli Arab, not Palestinian Arab. They feel very strongly about being Israeli. which is an interesting insight into how they feel, not how other people want to impress on them how they feel. And the Israel Democracy Institute, which is a left-of-centre think tank, did the whole survey and came up with this. Here's another two pieces that you should know. The people with the highest level of education, the people with the highest per capita income, and with the highest per capita land ownership in Israel are Christian Arabs. Okay? Now let's talk about the Arab population as a whole. There's no question that if I look at the population as a whole, there are two areas that have major issues in terms of their status. One of them is the Muslim Arabs, and the other one is the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim. They have a lower level of economic level, they have a lower employability, they have a high level of poverty, etc., etc., etc. Are there things that we can do in order to do that? Without any question. Do we have real challenges in terms of some of the Arab population in Israel? Absolutely. At the same time, the government announced a $7 billion investment into infrastructure in the last 2 years. If you look at universities over the last year, there was a significant increase in Israeli Arabs at universities and graduated, by the way, a lot of them women. And because of the success of that, the funding authority has just doubled that program for the next year in order to increase more money. We're not perfect. We have got some serious issues where the Arab population would argue they're de facto discrimination. I don't think it's institutional. Okay? In the same way that if you look at minorities in this country, minorities will say there's discrimination against them and they don't have the same abilities and the same opportunities. I believe the survey was done comparing minorities in Israel, America, Britain and Switzerland. And they took things such as economics, education, crime, etc., etc. And Israel's Arab minority, as opposed to the minorities in the other countries, was significantly better off in all the categories. So are we struggling in our minority? Are we having issues there with the Arab minority? Absolutely. Are we doing as well or better than other Western democracies who have minorities? I think so as well. I think it's a challenge. I think we need to deal with it. I think we need to work on it. I don't think we're perfect by any sense. And I think there's no question that some Israeli Arabs will feel that they have some form of discrimination against them. And I think that we as a state need to resolve that.
Time for one more question.
Yeah, please.
I'm interested what your reasons are for believing that Jerusalem should not be divided as a very important religious site for Jewish populations and Christian Arab populations. It seems to the outsider, like call me naive, but it seems to the outsider like the ideal compromise to have it divided. So what are your reasons for thinking that it should not be divided?
So firstly, divided cities don't work. I'm still waiting for someone to show me a divided city that's worked. Okay? We only need to talk about countries all over the world, histories of conflicts where the division of the city, I'm at the moment listening to the Brexit debates, and the biggest issue is whether there's going to be a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. They're two different countries. Because they recognise borders are really problematic and they cause conflict. So that's the first reason. But it's more than that. Look, in the history of Jerusalem, the only time that freedom of religion has ever been guaranteed is under Israeli control. Okay, if you look at every other piece of history, the freedom of religion for all religions has never, ever been guaranteed. Under the Jordanians, Jews weren't allowed to, under the Ottomans, the same thing. But you go back, it's always the same. The other thing is that Jerusalem's never been the capital of any other independent country, other than Israel and for the Jewish people. Okay? Jews have got a 3,000-year-old link to the country, to Jerusalem. It's always been our capital. Every peace agreement that's ever been signed, or ever been talked about, or ever been proposed, has Jerusalem as the capital. There can't be a peace agreement without Jerusalem as its capital. Our centre of government is in Jerusalem. And I also think that you need to take into account the Israeli Arabs that are living in Jerusalem. If you look into East Jerusalem Arabs, and there have been survey after survey after survey being done by all sorts of pollsters, and I encourage you to have a look online. In every single one of those polls, the majority of Israeli Arabs, or Arabs living in East Jerusalem, have said that in a proposed agreement between Israel and a Palestinian state, they would want to live under Israeli rule. Which says a lot about what they think the Palestinian state is going to be. And I think that for all of those reasons, Jerusalem shouldn't be divided. Jerusalem should remain under Israeli control. We've guaranteed freedom of religion. We've guaranteed control. We've done all of those things, and therefore those are the reasons that I think that it needs to be under our sovereignty. Okay. We've got time for one more, I think.
One more?
One more.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about settlements, actually. And
There you go. I brought it on myself. Go on.
well, no, I just mean in general. I mean, we've kind of seen how history is by and large judged South Africa, apartheid South Africa. And I wondered how you think. You mentioned that you're within academia and you go to universities and you speak about it. I wondered how you think history would judge the settlement expansion over the last 2 decades or so.
Okay, so I'm going to, again, you put lots of things. I'm going to give you 3 things I'm trying to do. Firstly, the apartheid comparison is, and I know you're not making it, but it's deeply, deeply insulting. It's deeply, deeply insulting to South Africans who fought against apartheid. As I said to you, I spent 3 years in South Africa, and I spoke to a number of black South Africans from the ANC who fought against apartheid and spent time in Israel. And they all said the same thing. The comparison is just such an insult to their struggle, their real, genuine struggle against it. And again, it means that if you make that comparison, you either don't know what apartheid was, you don't know what the situation in Israel is today, or you do know and you're making a comparison for nefarious reasons. But on to the question about the settlements. So the settlements are very, very interesting, and I'll give you 2 answers. Answer number 1 is if settlements were really the issue, then, and we did what everyone says, which is withdraw every single settlement, clear out every single settlement, withdraw to the so-called 1967 borders.
I mean expansion. I don't mean withdrawing all of them, but I mean
Okay.
just specifically expansion.
So look, so if we look at settlements, we haven't built any new settlements in the last 20 years. Israel hasn't built a single new settlement. There's been expansion. The settlements have grown through natural growth. But here's something that you probably didn't know. Settlements can only be built on, cannot be built on private land. Even if you buy the land as an Israeli, settlements can't be built on private land. Land can only be built on land that is government or non-privately owned. But the reason that says that Israel says is, look, this land in 1967, Israel took the land in a war. Let's look at the history. 1947, the country was divided, the area was divided, the Palestinians, the Arabs rejected the division, Israel accepted the division. 1948, war happens, Jordan takes the West Bank. Okay, Jordan controls the West Bank from 1948 to 1967. 1967 Six-Day War takes place, Israel takes the West Bank. That West Bank, at no point was it taken from anybody who ever claimed sovereignty over that land. In 1989, Jordan renounced any claim of sovereignty over the West Bank. No one other than the Palestinians claims sovereignty over the West Bank, and they don't have any history of sovereignty there. The land, state land, doesn't belong to anybody as a state. The Jordanians renounced any claims. The Palestinians never had control over it and never had sovereignty over it. And therefore, Israel states this land is therefore, as such, state land. And you can therefore build on it because no one's claimed it. Not the Palestinian people individually. And that therefore, the only way it can be resolved is through negotiations. So there's the expansion there. And again, if you look at this, and again, most people don't know this, 76% of all of the settlements are on a small strip on the border with Israel. Okay, 76% of all the population is on that border with Israel. So the expansion is also small. And it's one of the issues that we need to have a conversation with the Palestinians. And we've proven in the past. Remember, when we withdrew from Egypt in when we had signed a peace treaty with Egypt, we withdrew from the Sinai, we took down settlements. When we withdrew from Gaza, we took down settlements. And we took down settlements in the West Bank, by the way. And the Prime Minister has said we're prepared for painful compromise. So I think the settlements are a red herring. And I think that really history will judge those who are unwilling to make compromise as the real people in the future who cause the problems. I'm going to finish with this, and I know we're pushed, otherwise I've got to get trained by you. I'm going to finish with this. Look, I know I've talked about lots about some of the conflict, but I want to finish by saying the following. I am hopeful. We've got so many challenges ahead of us. But we're only 70 years old. This May we're going to be 71 years old. We're still a thriving democracy. We've achieved amazing, amazing things. We've got another election coming up. And all of the issues you've raised are serious challenges. But I believe we'll resolve them. I also believe we'll have peace with our neighbours. And I believe we'll have peace with our neighbours for one very simple reason. People don't want to live in a state of conflict. People don't want to be in a place where they may be burying their children because of conflict. That isn't a natural state to be in. It just isn't a natural state to be in. I have two young boys, a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. I genuinely have nightmares now about my boys going into the army. At the age of 18, they'll have to go into the army. I have nightmares about it now. They're 3 and 6. And I have nightmares about it not only because of what might happen to them, but what they might have to do and what that will do to them. Even if you come out the other side, you're still going to have issues. And you're still going to have done things. And therefore, I've got more to gain from peace than anybody else in this room, I believe. And therefore, that's the reason that I believe there'll be peace. And I believe that we'll resolve this issue. And we'll resolve the other issues. And if we look at the history of the world, all the intractable issues in the world that people said couldn't be resolved, none of them could be resolved until the day they were resolved. And so yes, our situation looks intractable, our situation looks desperate, but I have such genuine faith and genuine belief that we'll come to an agreement, and our lives will be better, and our lives will be rosier, and our lives will be in a much better place because of that, both ours, the Palestinians, and all of our neighbours. And so I didn't even get in to talk about what's happening in the Middle East and how we're having contacts and conversations with more Arab states today than we've ever had in our history. I didn't have a conversation to talk about half the high-tech and half the development and half the international relations that we're making. But I want to say that Israel's much more than the conflict. We're much more than that. We've got much more to us. We've got much more dynamic. We've got much more issues. And I want to say to all of you, thank you for coming in and really asking some of the difficult questions. I hope I've answered your questions. But in the minimum, I hope I've made you think that what you thought you knew when you came in, you don't now know when you go out. And what you thought was your committed belief one way or the other isn't as committed as it was. Because if you leave here thinking that everything's black and white, you just don't get it. It's not. It's all shades of grey, and that's why we haven't solved the problem. So thank you very, very much for being in here, and thank you very much for giving your time. Thank you for chairing it, and thank you for an amazing time in Durham.
I just want to say thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. A really big thank you to Anastasia from the Bubble who helped organise everything, and an even bigger